In the wake of November 2025, President Donald Trump made a public declaration that caught diplomatic attention. In his words, if the Nigerian government continues to allow the killing of Christians, the USA will immediately stop all aid and assistance to Nigeria. I may very well go into that now disgraced country, guns blazing, to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible atrocities. In his words, he said, I'm hereby instructing our Department of War to prepare for possible action. If we attack, it will be fast, vicious, and sweet. Just like the terrorist thugs attack our cherished Christians. The announcement came with the kind of thunder that usually follows silence. A move framed as solidarity, yet shadowed by a history of self-interest and calculated influence.
They're killing record numbers of Christians in Nigeria. They're killing the Christians and killing them in very large numbers. We're not going to allow that to happen.
It is not the first time Washington has stretched a helping hand towards Africa, but as history has shown, American hands rarely reach without holding something in return. Trump's words were decisive. They were moral in tone, militaristic in posture, and instantaneously geopolitical in consequence. They also raised a simple question that we must now ask plainly. Why now? After a decade of violence, why this urgency? And what does it mean for Nigeria, for Africa, and for the future of sovereignty on our continent? We must begin with the facts on ground. Nigeria, a nation of more than 200 million people, sits atop Africa's largest oil reserves, a seat of immense potential and geopolitical weight. Yet, it also stands on shaky legs. Centuries before the word terrorism entered Nigeria's vocabulary, the seeds of conflict were already sown. Islam came first, born by merchants and scholars across the Sahara into Kanem Borno and the Hausa kingdoms around the 11th century. It took root not by force but through trade, law, and learning. By the 19th century, the Sokoto Caliphate had risen, a vast Islamic state that stretched across the north. Religion was not just faith, it was governance, identity, and civilization. Then came from the coast another faith, Christianity, ushered in by British colonial rule and European missionaries. Their mission stations sprouted across the south, their message wrapped in salvation but driven by subjugation. Conversion, in many cases, meant control. The British ruled Nigeria by deepening these divisions, North versus South, Muslim versus Christian. Independence came in 1960, but the fault lines endured. Nigeria has become a state scarred by conflict, from the Dogon Nahawa massacre in 2010, where entire communities were slaughtered overnight, to the Chibok abduction of 2014, where 276 schoolgirls were taken by Boko Haram, to the Agatu bloodletting of 2016, where farmers in Benue State were slaughtered and villages were razed. Nigeria has been through cycles of violence that have produced tens of thousands of victims and millions displaced. These were not isolated tragedies. A country so critical, yet so fractured, becomes a fertile playground for external powers seeking to extend their reach without firing a shot. For over a decade, the global powers watched. No troops were sent, no military urgency declared. The victims were too far, maybe too poor, and perhaps too African to matter geopolitically. Yet, President Trump's public statement flattened that complexity into a simple moral story: persecuted Christians, savage killers, and the United States as the rescuer. The second lens through which we must view this moment is economics, and here Nigeria's transformation over the last 2 years is especially relevant. In 2024, the Dangote refinery near Lagos began commissioning operations built by Africa's richest private industrialists. It is not a minor plant. At $20 billion and with a capacity of 650,000 barrels per day production, Dangote is the largest single-train refinery in the world and ranks amongst the top refineries globally. For decades, Nigeria exported crude and imported refined petrol. The refinery was designed to change that, to refine locally, to supply domestic markets, and to export refined products to neighboring countries. The irony deepens when one considers timing. Nigeria's first fully operational mega refinery, an industrial colossus symbolizing self-reliance and potential economic independence from Western fuel imports, capable of altering global crude dynamics, reducing Nigeria's reliance on foreign refineries, and potentially shifting Africa's economic center of gravity. Suddenly, America's renewed military interest doesn't look coincidental but strategic. In global geopolitics, markets and security bloc, whoever helps secure a country's energy infrastructure often earns significant leverage over its economy. So, when the US posture shifts from silence to threat, we must ask whether motive is only moral outrage or whether strategic access to energy and minerals is also at stake. The same continent that produces cobalt, lithium, needed for the world's batteries, is now also home to refineries that could rework the contours of energy dependence. That is a price any global power would watch closely. History offers cautionary examples. In 2011, under the banner of preventing mass atrocities, NATO and its partners authorized military action in Libya. The immediate claim was the protection of civilians. Muammar Gaddafi's forces were halted. Gaddafi himself was killed. The regime collapsed, but the aftermath was catastrophic. Libya splintered into militias and fiefdoms. Its oil infrastructure was pillaged and privatized in chaotic, often opaque deals. The promised democratic transition never arrived. Instead, the country became a conduit for mercenaries, smuggling, and regional instability effects that rippled across the Sahel and the Mediterranean for years. In Afghanistan, 20 years of military engagement and state-building efforts ended in collapse when foreign forces withdrew in 2021. Billions were spent, institutions crumbled. The lesson: force can remove a threat, but cannot on its own build the structures that sustain peace. Iraq tells a similar story. The removal of Saddam Hussein created openings that the invading powers could not manage, and a decade of turmoil followed. These are not simply liberal critiques of intervention. They are empirical observations. Foreign military action frequently produces immediate tactical gains, but not necessarily long-term political stability. When both are followed by contractors, resource contracts, and conditional loans, the social contract between state and citizen may shift, often to the detriment of ordinary people. If intervention in Nigeria were to follow that pattern, what would it look like? First, a legal question. Under the United Nations Charter, the use of force across borders is lawful only if a state consents, or if it is authorized by the Security Council, or if it is undertaken in self-defense against an imminent threat. That legal framework exists for a reason: to protect sovereignty. Nigeria's leadership has already pushed back publicly. Abuja insists on being treated as an equal partner, not a vassal. Second, a security architecture question. US military involvement could take many forms: advisors, intelligence sharing, special operations, or kinetic actions. Each has consequences. Intelligent ops could improve targeting against violent groups, but the real question is, are the locations of these terrorists really hidden? Third, an economic question. When security and aid comes with conditions, budgets tied to procurement, legal reforms tied to trade access, local autonomy over resources can erode. Take Libya after 2011. Foreign companies and warlords shared resources spoils, state institutions weakened, revenues that could have funded reconstruction were lost to predatory arrangements. Nigeria must consider whether protection will come at the cost of losing value in its oil and mineral sectors. There is another crucial dimension: the domestic political logic. President Trump's public remarks, a moralistic language of religious persecution, the vow to cut aid, and the instruction to the Department of Defense also engage a domestic audience. Within the United States, evangelical constituencies are politically significant. The image of defending persecuted Christians resonates strongly with those voters. Geopolitically, it also resonates a moral rationale to justify force to a domestic public. But this convenience complicates international relations. When moral language is instrumentalized for domestic politics, the global policy that follows can be rushed, less deliberative, and more performative. It risks conflicting distinct problems, religious persecution, criminal violence, and governance failure into a single justification for force. Trump's declaration, many analysts argue, is not an isolated act of goodwill. It must be read against the backdrop of global competition for African loyalty. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, has poured billions into African infrastructure, while Russia has been cultivating military alliances through the Wagner network and arms deals. America, sensing its influence waning, needs a new foothold. Nigeria, the economic heart of the continent, seems to be the perfect gateway. Investigative analysts suggest that US intelligence views Nigeria as a risk, a potential African superpower that could either anchor the continent or drift towards rival spheres of influence. By embedding military cooperation, the US gains access, intelligence sharing, base rights, and influence over Nigeria's defense procurement. In essence, aid becomes a currency for control. Nigeria's security forces are under-resourced. Corruption is endemic. Political elites have in the past prioritized patronage over protection. The vacuum of effective governance has created space filled by criminals, extremist groups, and predatory actors. When a foreign power offers help, the temptation to accept is undeniable. But acceptance without conditions or acceptance under pressure risks long-term compromise. We cannot pretend the choice is easy. If Nigeria rejects help, communities living in terror remains exposed. If it accepts help, especially if it is coercive or conditional, Nigeria may survive in the immediate term while surrendering a measure of sovereignty that will constrain its choices for years. The world is watching. America needs Nigeria. Perhaps more than Nigeria needs America. But in the theater of global power, perception is everything. Trump's declaration might appear as an offer of protection, but to those who listen closely, it sounds like an old echo of empires cloaking ambition in the vocabulary of friendship. There are practical next steps that could change the calculus: a Nigerian-led request for transparent multilateral assistance, rigorous parliamentary oversight of any resource-related contracts, and immediate investment in rural governance to reduce the incentives that push herders and farmers to conflict. If outside states wish to assist, they should accept African terms: transparency, oversight, local employment, and binding human rights safeguards. Anything less is not partnership, it is patronage. This moment is not only a test of Nigeria's leadership, it is a test for the continent. When powerful nations arrive with proclamation of protections, Africa must not be dazzled by the rhetoric. We must demand truth, transparency, and terms that put people first. We must be clear on one final point. Saving lives is a moral imperative. Protecting sovereignty is a political necessity. They are not mutually exclusive, but they must be pursued together. If the United States truly wants to help Nigeria, let that help be framed by African priorities and African oversight. If it wishes to act otherwise, let us recognize that history has shown the cost. For Africa to survive and thrive, we must insist on a partnership that empowers, not on help that humbles. Because in the end, protection that matters most is the protection we build for ourselves.
Voice of Africa by Africans.